Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. This is New Books in Eastern European Studies, and I'm your host, Jill Messino. Today I'll be speaking with Stephen Norris about a recent book he edited and also wrote 3 chapters for, Museums of Communism, New Memory Sites in Central and Eastern Europe, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2020. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Jill. It's good to be here.
Dr. Norris received his PhD from the University of Virginia in Russian history in 2002. He is currently Walter E. Havighurst Professor of Russian History at Miami University, Ohio, where he teaches courses on genocide in the 20th century, the World Wars, and Russian, Eurasian, and Soviet history, as well as courses on history and literature. His publications include Blockbuster History in the New Russia, Movies, Memory, Patriotism, published with Indiana University Press in 2012, and A War of Images, Russian Popular Prints, Wartime Culture, and National Identity, 1812 to 1945, which was published with Northern Illinois University Press in 2006. He has a forthcoming book entitled The History Painters, Art, History, and the Making of Russian National Identity, which is forthcoming with Bloomsbury in 2022. So, Stephen, this is quite an expansive book, both thematically and geographically, and includes museums in the Baltics, Russia, East Central Europe, with topics ranging from occupation to famine to uprising to the Gulag, arcade games, and Stalin. So can you tell us how you came to edit this book, as well as author 3 of its chapters, and why the interest in public representations of communism?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Jill. And I'll take the second question first because it's the longer story and maybe more interesting story. I guess in some ways, I first became interested in the public representations of communism when I was doing my dissertation research in Moscow in 1999. And when I first visited what had been called the Graveyard of Fallen Statues, that's where all the statues removed after 1991 were taken. It's now the Park of Arts. The former Stalin statue's there. The infamous statue of Dzerzhinsky is there. And it was I think my first real encounter with the way in which communist era legacies were made public in a different format. And then, of course, that Graveyard of Fallen Statues was in the location where the new Tretyakov Gallery is, which opened in 1999. So I went there not long after it opened and noticed as I went through the gallery that this is the branch of the Tretyakov Gallery devoted to 20th century art. So I was going through the galleries and it ended more or less in 1930. So in part because of economics, they couldn't open all the halls yet, but in part because the Tretyakov authorities hadn't yet decided what to do post-1930 with the introduction of socialist realism. In other words, how do you post-communism, in post-communism, how do you deal with the legacies of communist art? So it was just empty. The 20th century ended in 1930. And that really got me thinking about how, difficult it was using public spaces and sites to narrate or work through the communist past. I mean, subsequently, I've been back to the new Tretyakov Gallery, and all the halls are open. There's a couple rooms devoted to socialist realist art, and then most of the rest of the art after that period is underground art and avant-garde art. So there's a narrative there. So that kind of really got me thinking initially about this issue, and subsequent travels to the region that you could see more and more places like that and more difficult decisions like that one. The real interest in the project began because I've been fortunate enough to take part in several study abroad workshops that include Miami students and faculty, including ones to Berlin in 2009, which was deliberately planned to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall, and then Ukraine and Poland in 2011. So I visited museums in each place. It's the sort of thing one does on a faculty-student workshop, and I could see how other countries tried to wrestle with and narrate through the recent past, and specifically in museum form. So that's the long-term interest, I guess. I didn't necessarily think that would go anywhere in the form of a book, but there is a very specific instance where I can date the beginning of this project, and that was a call for papers on the topic the topic of museums after communism for a panel at the World Slavic Conference in Japan in 2015, and then one the next year for the Association of the Study of Nationalities annual conference in New York. And because there were calls for papers on these subjects, it convinced me that there was something to the topic of new museums. and a number of scholars were writing about museums and memory. And it's worth noting everyone on those panels, those two panels, participated. Julie Fedor, Daria Mattingly, Muriel Blav, all participate in these two works. So I felt like there was a community of scholars out there that were also interested in the subject, and that's what launched my decision to edit a book about it. I was specifically interested, you asked about why I wrote 3 chapters. I was specifically interested in writing about the Ukrainian museum, the Blonsky Prison Museum in Lviv, because I visited it in 2011, was really struck by it in all kinds of ways and wanted to work through it in my own mind. And then the Polish Uprising Museum, which I also visited in 2011. The GDR museum that I wrote about came after some initial attempts to find someone else to write it fell through. So it allowed me to use my rusty German again. So there's long-term interests, and then the very specific, gosh, there's other people out there doing this. Let's put together a book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm a big museophile, so I really enjoyed reading the book and look forward to visiting actually most of these museums because I've only been to a few of them. Okay, so I was wondering if we could start by having you discuss the major question or major questions around which this book is framed.
I think the big question is maybe the obvious one, but still an important one. How have post-communist states attempted to remember the communist era in museums? I mean, we all know museums are important locations for how public memory gets mapped out. So how have these new states, these newly independent states, tried to deal with this recent past? But with that big question out of the way, I think one of the things that the book tries to cover is to answer the question: what sort of trends do we see in these remembrance practices? Are there similarities across countries that we might expect or might not expect? And then, of course, with that comes, you said 2 or 3 questions. What problems are evident in the museums that have appeared since 1989 or 1991? What's not in the museums, for example, or what's ignored or pushed into the room that no one ever goes into, for example. And then I think the last question that's worth posing here is that, how have Russian museums sought to capture the past? Because there's very specific elements to the ways that Russian remembrance practices have developed since 1991. Back to that Tretyakov gallery story I began with, those empty halls have now been filled, but they were empty for a while because the answer to the question, how do we deal with socialist realist art, hadn't yet been answered in 1999 even.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that the book is so expansive that it covers, pretty much all of Eastern Europe, so that you can make these comparisons and really understand how regime change after 1989, 1991 affects the representation of the past, and then, of course, the various actors that are involved in this process. Okay, so let's move on to the sections of the book. And the book is cleverly broken down into exhibits. So you've got exhibit halls, right? A, B, C, D, E. So let's start, obviously, with Exhibit A, the Hall of Genocide, Occupation, and Terror. Can you discuss the approaches and aims of museums that fall into this category and provide a couple of examples?
Absolutely. I'm glad you found the approach clever. That was a late-breaking idea I had to kind of organize the book and think of it as an exhibit itself. So there's different halls and exhibits, as you said. And it's also worth saying that I was quite pleased that I found so many willing participants when I sent out some emails, contacted friends of friends through colleagues, and got so many people willing to write about so many different museums. So it really does cover the region pretty well, I think. I'm pleased about that. But to answer your question, the first hall it covers the most prominent theme in museum remembrance, and that's been to focus on the Soviet period as one of occupation, one defined above all by violence directed usually against a particular national group, and therefore one that even some museums claim might be genocidal, fitting the specific term of attempting to eradicate in whole or in part a national group through practices of violence waged by the Soviet regime. So these aren't insignificant or even necessarily false views, but they do attempt to mask other more complicated histories, which is what I think the chapters in that exhibit hall or that section deal with. That section has 5 case studies. Neringa Klumbite's chapter on the Lithuanian Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, which I've also been to. You mentioned, Jill, that you've been to some of these. Mate Zambori's chapter on the House of Terror in Budapest, one of the few I haven't been to. My chapter on the Blonsky Prison Museum in Lviv. Steve Barnes' wrote about 2 Gulag museums in Kazakhstan, and Katya Wetzel wrote about the Riga's Cheka house. So to go into a couple of the examples, as you asked, in the Baltic republics, each country established what were called an occupation museum, and all usually had that word in the title. With the Lithuanian version, the one that Neringa Klumbite wrote about, even calling it the Museum of Genocide Victims. And the focus in this museum, which is indicative of all 5 of the museums really in this section, was on the Soviet invasion and occupation of the country. In the case of Lithuania, after the Nazi-Soviet pact, and then therefore the waves of deportations of Lithuanian intellectuals and nationalists that followed that first occupation of the Soviet regime. And then, of course, the continued imprisonment, deportations, and suppression of Lithuanian independence after 1945, all the way until 1990, 1991, when the Soviet Union broke apart. So the basic message in that Lithuanian Museum of Genocide Victims was, of course, victimization. Again, truthful. Of course, Lithuanians were victimized by the Soviet regime, deported. It's hard to find anyone in Lithuania that didn't have a family member deported by the Soviet regime. But it also, and herein lies the challenge and the problem, it pushed collaboration or even accommodation under the rug. So the focus in that museum was on the way the Soviet state wronged Lithuanians. And it also meant that that was the genocide covered in it. Thus, what happened in World War II, for example, to Lithuanian Jews wasn't initially discussed. And as Neringa Klumbite notes, however, because of criticism of this approach, that is the overwhelming focus on Lithuanians as victims of a Soviet regime, and ethnic Lithuanians more specifically, the museum has evolved and even renamed itself in 2018 the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights, kind of illustrating some of the challenges in doing this. The plural is now in occupations. And there are now 2 displays. They're small, but they're still there, devoted to the Holocaust. So, Neringa covers a potential problem, as she asks in her chapter, what does it mean for a new country to legitimize pain and suffering as the key to sovereignty? As she writes, the museum condemns terror that causes pain, expresses sympathy for the suffering people, and yet also legitimates suffering as a path to sovereignty. She calls her chapter Sovereign Pain. It's very evocative, very interesting. The second example is easier for me because I wrote the chapter on the Lonsky Prison Museum in Lviv, Ukraine, which focuses quite specifically on the NKVD massacres that occurred there in June 1941, as again an initial Soviet occupation ended and as the Nazi occupation was about to be established. Before the Wehrmacht arrived in Lviv, Ukraine in June 1941, the Soviet secret police murdered all the prisoners in this prison, many of whom were Ukrainian nationalists. That's why they're being held there. And the discovery of these massacres, first by local residents and then the Wehrmacht, initiated a pogrom in the city of Lviv, directed against the Jewish residents. But the museum that exists now in Lviv, the Lonsky Prison Museum, focuses primarily on those June 1941 massacres, not on the subsequent use of the site by the Gestapo, which is mentioned but not focused on, or much on the KGB's use of the site, again mentioned but not focused on. So that prison museum is devoted to seeing Ukrainian nationalists as martyrs for the nation, and the Soviet era as one of occupation and terror. That's why the section is called what it is. And again, these events happen, but it's the focus here that matters.
And so you talk about some of the museums that employ a double genocide approach. And so which of the ones that are investigated in this section would be reflective of that?
I think that's primarily an approach that's been significant in the Baltic regions, and it's been made by many politicians and public figures. And the idea here is to make Nazi crimes and Soviet crimes equivalent morally, historically, and even legally. And the byproduct of this idea, and the reason why it's so problematic, is that the double genocide concept can often be used to downgrade the significance of the Holocaust, and with it, sweep issues of collaboration under the rug. So in a sense, it boils down to fostering the idea that the Baltic republics and most of Eastern Europe, and the focus in this mentality is on the dominant ethnic group in specific countries, were victimized by 2 genocidal systems. making these states, as some articles claim, the winners of the suffering Olympics. And in its crudest conception, it explicitly excludes Jews from the nation, and states even in the worst form of this thinking that Lithuanian Jews, for example, are seen as active communists, that they welcome Soviet occupations, they were members of the NKVD. So the victims of these two genocides are ethnic Lithuanians in this version of the story, or so on and so forth, if you take it to include the Latvians or Estonians or Poles. Now, the museums themselves don't necessarily make these claims. They're not explicit. But many critics have rightly seen the use of the word genocide, especially in the Lithuanian Museum, or used on the walls of exhibits as sort of bolstering this double genocide narrative. The Lonsky Prison Museum, the one I just mentioned a moment ago, for example, focuses on the murder or punishment of ethnic Ukrainians, not the Ukrainian Jews who were also murdered there or in other sites around Lviv. So it's a dangerous, I think, narrative that filters through some of these museums.
So not only does this approach not acknowledge the suffering of Jews and, of course, the role of the dominant ethnic population in certain cases meting out terror towards them, but it appropriates the term to apply to the dominant ethnic group.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And what it also does is it eliminates the need for a discussion about collaboration,
right,
among local populations in the Holocaust. So if you've been victimized, and if you've been doubly victimized in genocides, then you really don't need to think too thoroughly about whether or not a member of your family or someone in your community also helped the Nazis perpetrate their genocide, because you've been solely a victim of genocides as a Lithuanian, as a Latvian, as a Pole, et cetera, et cetera.
So it offers a very uncomplicated portrait of the past, and one in which members of the dominant population don't have to revisit their past and feel any sense of guilt or shame. They can just move on, and then they've got a narrative in which they can build based on their victimization, and excludes then complex representations of the past, both in public spaces and also, I would imagine, in the textbooks as well, reflect this.
That's exactly right. And Julius Šukas, who's a really interesting author based in the University of Missouri, who's a Canadian Lithuanian, wrote a really interesting book about her grandmother and grandfather. I forget the title already, but Julius Šukas, you should look it up. In part because she deals with this. By you, I mean listeners, deals with this issue here. And what she discovered is that her grandfather, who had always been presented to her as a hero because he fought for independence in Lithuania, and he did, of course, was also a participant in the rounding up of Lithuanian Jews and their murder. So he's both a victim and a victimizer. And that kind of nuance, that complication, that messy personal history, as you just described, Jill, is what's not being discussed in these museums.
Right. And that gets me to my next question about the ways in which these museums tell us as much about the past as about the present.
Indeed. I think in its most basic approach, most of the museums covered in the book are attempts to shape memories, new narratives, and even sources of unity in these countries, particularly as a means to separate themselves from longstanding Russian or even Soviet domination. And an understandable need to separate themselves from this. The problem of being a small country like Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or having histories that seem to be connected solely to St. Petersburg or Moscow, as is the case in Poland, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. I get students all the time that only tend to see Ukrainian history or Polish history or Baltic history as important when it's connected to Russia. So these museums try to do an act of separation. And in the introduction to the volume, I write about how these new museums of communism try to supplant the Communist Museum that offered didactic narratives of the past. I think the Lenin Museum in Moscow, which no longer exists, is the best example of this. And I use a series of docents, what I call docents, Sergei Dovlatov and his suitcase from his novel by that name, Slavenka Drakulich's guided tour through the Museum of Communism, and the Ukrainian novelist Oksana Zabushka's The Museum of Abandoned Secrets, her novel, to show how the foundation of these museums represented long buried, often suppressed stories, very personal ones, stories of those being victimized or wronged. And these are sentiments not unique to the region per se. I mean, you could think of the new Smithsonian museums, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Museum of the American Indian, the newly announced National Museum of the American Latino, and the National Women's History Museum, all as ones that seek to integrate voices and experiences that have often been ignored, and in response to current political concerns. The approaches in the region covered in the book, however, are made within the context, though, of very specific national and local politics and the attempts to boost support through patriotism, especially uncomplicated patriotism, by shifting attention away from the messy aspects of the past, as we just talked about. And they're particularly problematic, last part of the answer to your question here, they're particularly problematic in places where new national memory organizations, even government organizations devoted to national memory, have appeared and explicitly sought to guide the understanding of the past to present-day patriotic positions. I mentioned the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland and the Institute of National Memory in Ukraine, for example, which those titles sound Orwellian and often act that way.
Yeah, and of course you see this throughout the region where institutes are engaging in similar practices and promoting a particular narrative of the past, a usable past, we can call it, in which shame is excised, guilt is excised, and the past is supposed to be a source of pride. And of course, one that also then focuses on victimization, but certainly not culpability.
Exactly, and where there's a government organization, a National Memory Institute that oversees it to make sure that these narratives are in place. I mean, that's what's different in this region than, say, the instances of Smithsonian museums, which arise out of roughly similar analogous concerns, but where there's not a government memory office that makes sure that it's any problematic aspects that were going to potentially appear in these museums are going to be swept away. And that's what's happening in the region.
Certainly, and especially places like Poland and Hungary, where scholars are experiencing more and more constraints with respect to what they can actually study, what projects get funded, and they're very much circumscribed by what is being dictated at the top.
Exactly.
Well, this gets me to a question about your chapter, one of your chapters, so chapter 3, which examines the Lonsky prison and Lviv, and you use the term memory laundering. So can you elaborate on this term?
Sure. So it's a term I coined to cover who is the most controversial figure in contemporary Ukraine, at least in terms of the politics of memory and ongoing memory wars in the region that we've just talked about. And that's, of course, Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist leader who helped found the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, and later the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and sought to establish an independent Ukrainian state free from Polish and Russian control, but an ethnically pure Ukrainian state. That was Bandera's motivation, and that's what the OUN was founded to do. And depending on how you see things, I mean, at worst, I guess, Bandera's followers collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. At best, I mean, if this is even a best case scenario, he used the Nazi occupation to help push the agenda of making an ethnically pure Ukrainian state. And this was even more complicated because Bandera himself was in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II, but his followers tried to purify Ukraine by massacring Poles and Jews in the midst of World War II. So Bandera's bequeathed a very violent, complicated legacy, but one in present-day Ukraine that many want to boil down to one key factor, and that is that he's seen as his primary goal is one to bring about an independent Ukraine. Therefore, he's one of the founding fathers or founding participants in an independent Ukraine created after 1991, and thus Bandera is our hero. There's many signs and graffiti when I was in Lviv in 2011 that just said, Bandera nash heroi, our hero. And under Viktor Yushchenko's presidency, when Yushchenko turned to the right and sought more support from nationalists, this is in the wake of the Orange Revolution, Yushchenko named Bandera a hero of Ukraine, which made that notion that had been scrawled through graffiti a public one and allowed for statues to be built to him, streets to be renamed after him. So the Lonsky Prison Museum, which I write about in that chapter, is on Bandera Street. And that prison museum was also established in this climate. So Bandera had been held there in 1936 during his second trial after being arrested for his nationalist activities. He was tried in Warsaw for trying to bring about an independent Ukraine. That trial was seen by many ethnic Ukrainians as fixed. So the Polish Republic, that region was in Poland at the time, the interwar period. Polish Republic brought him to Lviv, retried him. He was held in the Lonsky prison. And that trial then is where he uttered the phrase "Glory to Ukraine," which became the rallying cry of Ukrainian nationalists who followed him. So this is a complicated story. I've given you a short gloss on it. A lot more can be said about it. But the memory laundering comes in because of this short version of the story, because Bandera's name, his face, and his experiences are included in the exhibits in this museum, along with the victims of the 1941 massacre. So he wasn't there in 1941. He was in a Nazi concentration camp, but many of his followers were held in the prison and massacred by Soviet secret policemen. And that is represented in the museum walls, but Bandera is actually placed in some exhibits on a list of well-known Ukrainian dissidents, writers, artists, so on and so forth, who were imprisoned at Lonsky by the KGB from the 1950s to 1980s. So, in other words, Bandera is laundered here. That is, his significance is laundered in memory. He becomes a victim of genocide and occupation, not a victimizer or perpetrator. He's placed first on a list of fighters for independence, Bandera to Vyacheslav Chornovil, the dissident.
Are you good with people? Maybe you're organized or have a knack for numbers. Well, then chances are you've got skills that could lead to a new career. A Google Career Certificate can help you get a foot in the door with top employers in fast-growing fields like IT support, project management, data analytics, and user experience design. It's professional-level training developed and taught by Google employees. And it's all online, so you can learn around your schedule. Put your skills to work. Go to grow.google/certificates.
Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. According to studies, less than 13% of all inventors who hold a U.S. patent are women. Black and Hispanic college graduates patent at half the rate of their white counterparts. But we can fix that by increasing participation in innovation and patenting by underrepresented groups. It would quadruple the number of American inventors and increase annual GDP by almost $1 trillion. Invent Together is a coalition of organizations, companies, universities, and concerned citizens committed to ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to invent and patent. Because the more diverse the American patent system gets, the stronger and more successful our nation will become. What can you do to help diverse inventors patent and unleash economic opportunity? Find out at inventtogether.org. Learn more and take action today.
Yeah, so he assumes a completely new legacy and persona.
Correct. Again, where his violent actions and the violent actions of his followers are scrubbed out. That's not focused on at all.
Cleansing of the past. Okay, let's move on to Exhibit B, which is the Hall of National Tragedies. Can you tell us how national tragedy is represented in these chapters and which group is featured? And then, of course, related to that, who is left out? Which stories are left out?
Great questions, yes. This section has two chapters, one that I wrote on the Warsaw Uprising Museum in Poland, and one by Daria Mattingly on the National Holodomor Victims Memorial and Museum in Kyiv. And the events they commemorate are therefore much more specifically located in history than Exhibit A's, where the museums tend to focus on the entirety of the communist era as one of occupation or genocide. Even in the case of the Lonsky prison, which hones in on June 1941, but it does so to explain all of 1939 to 41, first Soviet occupation, and 1945 to 1991. That's how Bandera is laundered into that history. So the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 and the Holodomor, the famine of 1932 and 33, are presented in these two museums as the most important single events in how modern Polishness and Ukrainianness need to be understood by the public. So to look at these two briefly, the uprising in Poland, of course, took place from August to October 1944. It was a revolt by the resistance home army to liberate Poland from Nazi occupation before the Red Army arrived. They were camped just across the river. It failed, and the rebellion was crushed by the Nazis, who then turned much of the city to rubble. I mean, this is an important event, a tragic event, and the museum commemorates that event as sacred, one that taps into long-standing ideas of Polishness. The Holodomor, of course, is the famine that resulted from Stalin's collectivization policies in Ukraine. Another horrific famine happened in Kazakhstan, of course, where 3.5 million plus people died. And that memorial museum is also presented as a sacred place, one where you have a chance to hear from those who died and learn from their tragedies. The same is true, I suppose, in the Uprising Museum, too. A lot of focus on voices and personal experiences. And in the introduction to the section, I refer to these as sites of glorification and victimization. So they're sites that let suppressed, silenced voices speak, because the Polish communist state, of course, downplayed 1944, because at its core it aimed to create an independent Polish state free from any other outside influence. And the Soviet state didn't permit discussions about the Holodomor because the collectivization campaign was the founding part of how the Soviet state industrialized. So these two sites allow these aggrieved memories to come to the fore. And you asked about who's left out and what the problems are in them. So they're not without their problematic aspects too. The Uprising Museum doesn't explore conformity, and in some ways seeks to challenge what many in Poland believe is a greater focus on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. That's mentioned in the Uprising Museum, but not very much. So it's an attempt to turn the interest in historical significance to the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and therefore to more ethnic Catholic Poles. And the Holodomor Memorial Museum, as Daria writes quite well, highlights what she calls the perils of an ethnocentric narrative, where the victims are all passive ethnic Ukrainians and the villains are all Soviets, and doesn't mention how non-Ukrainian populations living in the region also experienced famine, or how Ukrainians might have helped in the collectivization campaigns. It's sort of this black and white, pure villain, pure victim narrative memorialized there.
Right, so that the perpetrator is always of a different ethnic group, right?
Usually, or just, a Soviet. I mean, it's just sort of left to your imagination and the
It's vague.
Exactly.
Yeah, I assigned the chapter on the famine, and my students really engaged well with it. So I really appreciated that chapter. I was going to ask you a bit also about how experience and affect are central to these museums, right? So it's not necessarily about or simply about knowledge acquisition, but it's about one's affective, right, responses to the museum exhibit and how the museum is organized and designed.
Yeah, exactly. I've visited both of these places. Obviously, I wrote about the Uprising Museum, but I've also been to the Holodomor National Museum and Memorial, and they're very effective in how they capture affect, and they're very moving places. And one interesting aspect, I think, to build on your question, that some of the museums in the volume tackle, and the Warsaw Uprising Museum, I think, is most notable in this regard, is how they adopt practices pioneered in museum sites elsewhere, specifically the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I mean, anyone who goes there knows you get a passport, so you follow a personal life as you move through the exhibits, and it really does attempt to affect you emotionally. In the Uprising Museum, you take a calendar page off the wall from that day in 1944, or leading up to 1944, and you learn about some details of someone's life, or the weather, things like that. So you're already kind of connected to very specific personal individual stories. And the founding director of the Uprising Museum specifically said when he founded it, he wanted to put visitors in a certain mood because he wanted to reach younger Poles and connect them emotionally to the past. And as I write about in the chapter, for anyone who's ever been to the Uprising Museum, right in the middle as you walk in, there's the beating heart, it's what it's called. And it's an installation that has the days of the uprising inscribed on it. There's bullet holes. I mean, not really bullet holes, but what's meant to be bullet holes on it. You're supposed to put your ear to it, or you touch it, and you either feel or hear a patriotic heartbeat. So the idea is that the beating heart of Polishness is what fueled the uprising in 1944 and what continued to fuel Poles after after the uprising was crushed. There's a lot of hands-on exhibits in that museum, including a recreation of the sewers where the Home Army hid out in and used to fight the uprising. And the lights are turned off at certain points, and you're invited to kind of crawl through them, just like a member of the Home Army would have. The floors are even evocative the entryway has these recreated cobblestones of the streets of old Poland. So you're meant throughout to feel. You feel emboldened, you feel patriotic, you feel heroic, sometimes you feel angry. You can even fuel yourself with patriotic food in the recreated interwar cafe that evokes that time and place. So very much an attempt to build a connection to the past through emotion, through affect.
Yeah, I don't think I'd want to eat the food that's offered in the cafe. And I guess it's a little more challenging for the museum and the family because it's not yet completed, right?
Right. So they're still counting. And that's one of the things that museum in particular is doing. One of the noble things that Museum of Memory Site is doing is trying to finally put all the names and to the victims of the famine and to constantly scroll through all those names. So I think when I went there in 2011, I think the number had just surpassed 2.5 million. It's now over 3.5 million. So it's this ongoing work of tragedy, really.
Yeah, and it seems like the museum functions as more of a memory site, right, where there are commemorations rather than what we typically associate with a museum, exhibits and such.
That's correct. Yeah, it's small. As a museum, it's small. Although it does have museum in the title. It's much more a memorial site. But where the Uprising Museum is much larger and more of a typical museum, especially a typical 21st century museum, it's also a memorial site too. I mean, they're both dedicated to one single event as a stand-in for larger experiences and events in 20th century history in those two countries.
Yeah, when I visited the Warsaw Uprising Monument in fall of 2019, people had placed flowers and notes alongside the monument. So clearly people were still engaging with it. And it was a very powerful memory site.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's again, we're saying they're both very moving and both do speak to really important events, tragic events, violent events. So the approach in the two chapters is, of course, the good scholarly criticism. But I think, at least I hope, both try to understand these tragic events for what they are. I mean, these involve family members of people who come today and lay flowers down, participate in some of the activities and public events that both sites put on.
Yeah, what I found particularly interesting is that the notes that people had left behind were in Polish, were in English, were in a number of languages, and people had clearly were visiting Poland as tourists as well, and that they were struck by the museum, the monument, and that for them this was an important memory site, and they wanted to share their sentiments about it. Okay, so let's move on to Exhibit C, the Hall of Everyday Life. And maybe you can talk about the purpose of these museums. And also you talk about pieces of memory. So what are these pieces of memory?
Yeah, so here again in the Hall of Everyday Life, Exhibit C, there are two museums featured. The Museum of Communism in Prague, which was founded in 2001, and the GDR Museum in Berlin, which was founded in 2006. And the former one, as Muriel Blav writes, grew out of a desire, as she says, to show tourists what communism was about. And it focused, at least initially, on a blend of everyday objects and recreated workspaces. There was a kind of a factory room, a typical factory room from the Czech communist era. There were also interrogation rooms that the Czech secret police would have used, recreated in this museum. And it, from the get-go, founded in 2001, was often accused of being too kitschy, too nostalgic, especially by Czech political figures and scholars, in part because the initial location of the museum was famously located, as all the ads said, above the McDonald's next to the casino, right in the heart of Prague at the bottom of Wenceslas Square. And it featured very kitschy ads, although ones I loved, I have to say. And in part, these criticisms came because, of course, this museum seemingly did not focus on Czech victimization enough, like other museums in the region focused on this national victimization. The GDR Museum developed also interestingly, as a backlash against what its founders thought was an oversimplified focus on terror as the essence of the East German communist history, one that was embodied, at least in this view, in the Stasi Museum, the former headquarters of the Stasi, the secret police in East Germany. And as I describe in that chapter, it's kind of a war, but we might see this as the war between what's the better version of East German history, Goodbye Lenin, the film Goodbye Lenin, or the film The Lives of Others. That is the film about everyday life and loss, or is it about interrogation, terror, surveillance? So the GDR Museum is also, features everyday objects. That's the pieces of memory. Everything from a recreated kitchen that has all the communist era plates, knives, appliances, TV, to records like from the Pudis. That is these little pieces that individually speak to someone who used them, listened to them, partook in them during the communist era, but collectively they're sort of a pastiche of memory. And it too has been accused of promoting kitsch and nostalgia, or of whitewashing the more violent aspects of the communist era. Worth noting here, as I alluded to, the Museum of Communism in Prague has subsequently moved to new digs. They're nicer and bigger, but it's changed its focus a little bit. It's focused a little more on the repressive aspects of Czech communist history to counter those criticisms.
So one could argue that these museums of everyday life are a part of the broader conversation about the past, and they're kind of responding then to these other museums that focus purely or primarily on victimization.
Indeed, that's exactly right. They arose as places like the occupation museums had already opened in the Baltic republics, or the House of Terror had been founded in Budapest. So this was seen as a backlash to that by local, private local individuals who said that's not what the communist era was about, or entirely about. There were times where we were happy, where we got married. And I think that sentiment is captured quite powerfully in Goodbye Lenin, the movie, which was very popular in the region.
So would you argue that these museums of everyday life are also presenting a selective or reflect a selective version of lived reality during the communist period? Or do you think they do a better job of providing a more kind of comprehensive portrait that acknowledges the various ways in which people experienced communism?
Yes, that's the key question, isn't it, Jill? I think it depends on your viewpoint. And so maybe the answer to the question is other questions. So is it spreading a harmful form of nostalgia if you drive the Trabi simulator or touch the actual Trabi car in the GDR Museum in Berlin? So the Trabant, the popular car, there's a Trabi simulator. You can pretend to drive this communist car or actually touch one. Or is it, turning complex history into kitsch if you do so as a tourist, as I did? Or what about listening in on a recreated Stasi room which is also in the GDR Museum? Does that somehow whitewash or, I don't know, make that very real, often violent, horrific experience into something, fun for tourists? Or if you say the Museum of Communism in Prague has a really fun gift shop where you can buy, communist era toilet paper. If you buy it, and here I'll say I did buy some communist era toilet paper when I was there last, what does that mean exactly? So critics will say you're making the communist experience into a fun, playful arena, and that's bad. Proponents will say that the everyday was, of course, part of life too, and that a little bit of nostalgia perhaps helps you get over the past. In terms of your very specific question, I don't find these museums too problematic, in part because they do what their critics say they don't. There are exhibits and rooms devoted to repression, terror, violence, deportation, these sorts of things. But they're part of the larger experience of communism. So that is, for many, you could go there and, of course, understand that a member of your family was arrested and interrogated by the Stasi. You can see how that operated. You can see how it's a significant part of the communist era in East Germany. But you can also see, balanced with that, a typical living room that someone would have lived in at the time, or your Trabant car. So I think it allows the individual visitor to make up their own mind about what the meaning here is.
So they provide a more complex portrait than the museums that we've discussed previously, that the narrative is just very nationalistic, very focused on victimization, and really there isn't room for the messiness, right? And the different perspectives.
Right, at least as often told in the museums covered in the book. I guess I could point out here that, to play devil's advocate with myself, not covered in the book, but maybe in a later blog post, the Ninth Fort Museum outside of Kaunas, Lithuania, which I visited in 2016. So this is a site that was built as a fort in the Russian Empire to defend in a war, and it was used as a fort during World War I. So Russian imperial soldiers fought in it, defended against German armies. And then in the interwar period, and especially under Nazi occupation, after the interwar period, it was a convenient site for Nazi occupiers using local collaborators to round up Jewish populations, put them in the fort. There was a massacre there in the fort of the Jewish residents there. And then later in the communist period, it was used as a prison by the KGB. So it's these overlapping histories that are all traumatic and speak to the messiness of that place and that time. And the interesting thing about the museum is that while the focus is still on the Lithuanian experience of deportation, all of those histories are covered and covered quite well. So it's possible to offer layers, I think, in a way that maybe the everyday museums do. And I do understand the criticisms that for some people, especially some who were particularly targeted by the Stasi or the secret police in any country, that maybe focusing on toilet paper or Trabis is too kitschy.
Right. And also the concern that it kind of fetishizes this history and it's just for these, Western audiences, right?
Exactly.
So people come from the West. And that was going to be a follow-up question. Do we have any sense of who's visiting these everyday life museums? And this issue of, to what degree are they just money makers?
Right. So in the case of the GDR Museum and the Museum of Communism in Prague, the primary visitors are tourists, which is interesting, but also very problematic for, I think, reasons you articulated.
Great. So let us move on then to the Exhibit D, which is the Hall of Russian Memory. So can you say a few words about the museums that fall under this category?
I can. This was one of the more interesting decisions I had to make, and one of the peer reviews I received on the volume suggested that there shouldn't be a separate Russian hall. But I decided to go ahead and make it that way, and in part because one of the guides, the scholarly guides throughout this book is Tony Judt, the late great Tony Judt, whose article "The Past is Another Country" I think still powerfully describes the tendency in European post-war memory to blame another place for the traumas of the 20th century. So usually it's the Nazis or the Soviets, as we can now maybe understand in some of the museums we've discussed. The double genocide narrative suggests we as Lithuanians or Latvians were victimized by both Nazis and Soviets, and that's who we are as a people. That's understanding ourselves as a people is through these other countries impacting us, and it allows for no discussions, therefore, about any of the complicated aspects of the past, the personal histories of the way people could be victims and victimizers. But Russia, of course, the post-communist Russian state, couldn't adopt this tactic. You can't really blame yourself in any meaningful way. So that, while the museums in this hall have echoes of those elsewhere, they do have differences. So that there's 3 museums covered. One is the State Museum of the Gulag, which is a state-run museum that took over a privately run museum that seeks to understand, of course, the place of the Gulag in Soviet history and in post-Soviet memory. And as Jeff Hardy, who wrote the really great chapter there about this museum, says, it threads a very fine needle, but does so pretty well given the context and circumstances of Russia today, because it's both palatable to the state and to human rights groups. Although that threading of the needle has its challenges, as he discusses in his chapter. The second museum covered there is a little more like the Holodomor one, in that it's the Butova shooting range, which is not a museum per se, although one was initially planned there. It's a memorial site primarily where the NKVD shot people during the purges, the Stalinist purges, and it's affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. and who had discussions about placing a museum there, but instead has built new churches and other commemorative sites on that location that articulate a notion of martyrdom and suffering. So it's similar in that respect to places like the Holodomor site. But that's fine if the victim there was Orthodox, which is what's commemorated there. And many priests and Orthodox believers were among the victims at the Budova shooting range. But what if you were not? What if you were Jewish or atheist or someone else didn't believe in Orthodoxy? And Julie Fedor and Thomas Snigan, who wrote the chapter, they walk us really eloquently through the thorny, sometimes problematic relationship between the Russian state and the Orthodox Church over that site, and they interpret it in the end as a kind of Christian museum. We might even say an Orthodox museum. So not a museum per se, but one that often acts as a museum. And then the last chapter, the last site covered is Roman Abramov's chapter on the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games in Moscow. There's also a branch in St. Petersburg. I think there's one in Kazan as well. Anyway, it's on the Moscow one, and it's where you have the chance to use communist-era kopecks to play classic communist-era arcade games such as Sea Battle, and where you can relive your childhood or happy memories. And it's one that also, much like other sites, has this this ambiance of nostalgia and whether or not that's okay. Is it okay to play a Soviet-era arcade game using Soviet-era kopecks?
It's kind of like a living museum, right?
It is.
Because you're experiencing the time and, obviously using the currency and putting yourself in that situation. And it's a lighthearted take on the past. But is there anything necessarily wrong with that? Although I was kind of surprised it's considered an actual museum, you know what I mean? Because it seems so experiential that, I don't know, it just seems like something that is just resurrected for pleasure.
That's right. And it is interesting, and yet the title of the site is the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games. So it does try and convey that. I think that's a really interesting point.
And that's a private institution, right? So I wonder where the funds go then, ultimately, the profits go.
Right. It's interesting. It's worth pointing out here that the two everyday museums, that is the GDR Museum and the Museum of Communism in Prague, and the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games are all privately run. In fact, the tendency has been for these museums of everyday life that focus on objects are mostly privately run. And the museums that are focus on terror and victimization and horrific events are often state run.
Right, and the statue park outside of Budapest too is privately run.
Correct.
I wanted to just go back to the Gulag Museum, Moscow State Museum of Gulag History, and just ask you about the outreach that the museum does, because I was really impressed with that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of these museums do have really significant public outreach components. The Uprising Museum in Poland, as you mentioned, the Holodomor Museum and Memorial in Kyiv, and the Gulag Museum in Moscow does too. So its young director, Roman Romanov, hosts a number of discussions on really challenging topics. He doesn't shy away from difficult subject material. The museum hosts movie screenings. They host poetry readings. They sponsor walking tours throughout Moscow of sites associated with repression. They have scholarly seminars, public meetings. They also conduct oral history, so they try to compile personal stories that will later make their way into the museum. They were very active during the pandemic. They had a number of really interesting Zoom events. So it is part of the way a lot of these museums see themselves, and it is worth noting because it's certainly a positive aspect. Even in some of the more problematic museums that have these established narratives of victimization, they still have really significant, interesting, moving, nuanced public events.
Well, and I think this is significant, right, because it allows individuals to engage with the topics undertaken by the museum, right, that are the focus of the exhibits, but also see how that history is an ongoing project, right? Writing these histories, reinterpreting them, and recovering voices, right? So that it's not something that's fixed, it's something that's ongoing, and that they can be kind of active participants in this process.
Exactly.
And that there's a dialogic, right? There's an exchange between those who exhibit and engage in history, but also those who are there to observe it and interact with it.
Exactly. And with the oftentimes implicit, but even sometimes explicit view that these events and this collecting of new stories and collecting of new objects are going to help the museum evolve across time, which I think is a positive thing.
Definitely. Okay, so let's move on to Exhibit E, and why not end with Stalin, right? And so Exhibit E focuses on rotating exhibits, and it looks at the changing memories and shifting interpretations that are the focus of these two museums in this section. So it's the Joseph Stalin Museum in Georgia and the Vabamu Museum of Occupations and Freedom in Tallinn, Estonia. So could you talk about one or even both of these museums, and then how this notion of kind of changing memories and shifting interpretations?
Sure. Yeah. This section, the rotating exhibits, came because even after commissioning one of the essays, the one on the Tallinn Museum, it had rebranded itself. So the Laurie Weeks, who wrote the chapter, had to shift her own focus. Also worth pointing out, while the book was in press, the Museum of Communism in Prague changed a little bit, and the Lithuanian Museum of Genocide Victims changed its name. So, I sort of thought of this much like there are exhibits in museums that come and stay for a while and then shift out, that this is one way of thinking about it. And in many ways, it sort of captures the fact that the book is itself a snapshot of how memory practices were established in the first decades after communism, but that they change. So the two specific examples, the one in Georgia is one that attempts to answer the question, here, get your Sound of Music voice on. What do we do with a problem like Stalin? Do you focus on occupation and violence? If you continue to operate a national museum to Stalin, does it do more harm than good? And what do you do about the Soviet era museum of Stalin's birth in a post-communist society? So the answer, as Christine Gottfredson writes, is that the museum kind of, I don't know if it punted is the right word here, but basically what they did is they established a new room called the Room of Repression. And that's where you enter now. So you get a little bit about Stalinist crimes and what Stalin did as a leader, and then you move into more or less the old Soviet era museum. So it's almost like two museums in one that evokes the other, like the occupation museums, and then the other is let's just have the old museum be the old museum. And the question there then, because there's always questions that come with this, is that enough? I mean, do people go there and ignore the repression room, or do they pay attention to it, or how do you combine these two almost separate sites in this one museum? The Vabamu Museum of Occupations and Freedom in Tallinn was the formerly Occupation Museum, and it got renamed and rebranded so that the focus in it was less on victimization of one national group and more on the attempts to achieve freedom in Estonia. And therefore, you accentuate the positive in it. But that too wasn't without controversy. So a lot of critics in the region have accused it now of downplaying the violent aspects of communist life, that, they see Estonian history, like other Baltic histories, as one of occupation across time. So rebranding it and calling it occupations and freedom is, again, doing away with that aspect of the recent past. And I think in general, it's proof that these two examples are proof that museums, like memory itself, can change. It's malleable. And that's what the book, I think, hopes to capture, that these museums can and should and do evolve.
Well, the book certainly does. The question about the Stalin Museum is, though, to what extent is this kind of token, right? Acknowledging the repression. Okay, we better acknowledge this aspect, but we're really going to focus on,
That's right. Yeah, because a lot of the visitors come to see, this is Stalin's home, and they want to see that, and they want to see, in many ways, the preserved Soviet era museum to Stalin. And it's worth, I know people who visited it, and it's not like they're all neo-Stalinists. In fact, many are not, but they want to see that part of it. And you're right, to them, the repression room is just a token addition. It seems like a compromised position. It doesn't really fit very well.
And certainly with the glorification, I don't know if glorification is the right word, but definitely the rehabilitation of a positive image of Stalin by Putin.
Correct.
I wonder.
Correct. Yeah, and some, of course, do do think that the repression room shouldn't have been there at all because they see Stalin in positive terms. And many in Gori, his hometown, the fact that museum remained throughout this communist period is itself significant because they still see him as the local son made good.
Certainly. Local pride.
Exactly.
Okay, well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I really thoroughly enjoyed the book. So thank you so much for editing it and also writing 3 chapters. And of course, to your contributors who wrote fascinating chapters as well. And I guess I'll finish with a final question about your current project. So I mentioned the title of your forthcoming book, but maybe you could just talk briefly about it, or even a newer project if you'd like.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jill, for hosting me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm also grateful that you've assigned it to your students. So I have 3 things I'll mention briefly here of current projects, and one is related to the Museums of Communism. So I bought the museumsofcommunism.com web address and have a website, and my hope is to get more blog-like posts to it that cover more museums from places not necessarily covered in the book. Romania. There's a hint for you, Jill. Former Yugoslavia, places I tried to get articles for but couldn't, and maybe even museums in smaller cities. So my hope is the website, especially as this semester ends and I have more time to work on it, will be a place where we can cover, not just me, but where anyone can cover the evolution of some of the museums covered in the volume, or even offer a post about different museums so that you can really get an even larger range. So that's one thing. The book that you mentioned at the outset is part of the Russian short series I co-edit with Bloomsbury Press, along with Gina Vrutin in Illinois. And my own contribution to it will be, so these are short books on big topics is the idea. My own contribution will be on the so-called history painters of the 1880s and 90s in Russia. I've always been fascinated by Vasily Surikov, and Viktor Voznetsov, these 2 painters that painted these massive canvases. I mean, some like 7 feet by 12 feet. Morning of the Execution of the Streltsy is Surikov's famous canvas, or Bogatyria Heroes is Voznetsov's, that almost everyone in Russia knows as being quintessential Russian history painters. But they've had very little written about them in English, so I'm going to write about them, indulge myself, I guess, a bit. And then the last thing I should say here is I have this long-term ongoing research project on Boris Yefimov, the Soviet political caricaturist, who was the principal political caricaturist for Izvestia, also worked for Krokodil, and he worked in these positions from 1922, the year he moved to Moscow, and was named principal political caricaturist all the way to 1991. So his work is the entirety of the Soviet period.
Wow. So lots of stuff on visual culture, which is really exciting.
Indeed. I guess that's been one of my focal points in my scholarly career.
Well, I look forward to taking a look at the website and as it's updated, and also your newer publications. And I wish you the best of luck on those. And thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jill. It's been a pleasure.